Hey there, welcome to Mike's Collection, episode 309. When I started this channel 5 years ago, I started with episode 1, and I basically just sat here and I said, I don't really know what this channel is going to be. One of the ideas that I had considered and that I had floated back then was I thought about maybe just going through my old issues of Toy Fair magazine, which is exactly what it sounds. It's a magazine that was published from like the late 90s into the early 2000s. I think it ran for about 10 years. I think I did one episode where I went through an issue of Toy Fair magazine. But today what I'm going to do is a video that I've been wanting to do for a long time, which is a retrospective of the what we call the new Sculpt era of G.I. Joe, which launched in 2002. That was a really big year because that was the year that Masters of the Universe returned and G.I. Joe returned, and they returned in a really big way. So I had talked earlier about Toy Fair magazine, and the reason I mention that is because I'm going to haul out some old issues for this episode. So again, I can kind of give you a sense of what I was experiencing when these new G.I. Joes were coming out. It really is hard to imagine a time when you had to get your toy news from a monthly magazine, but that's really where we were, at the turn of the century. So here I'm going to go back to this episode or this issue of Toy Fair, and you see we've got Darth Maul on the cover. So the Star Wars hype was still happening, and this issue here is cover dated, so it's issue 51, and it is from November 2001. So, if memory serves, the second prequel hadn't even come out yet. So, Phantom Menace was 99, and I believe it was 2002 for Attack of the Clones. Anyway, regardless, so some of the things they're talking about on the cover here: Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, an 80s revival. There's a Gundam price guide coming out, and you'll see here G.I. Joe Reborn, all new toys. So this was literally probably the first time I heard about new G.I. Joes coming. So if I open this issue up to page 12, you see this is the Buzz. So this was kind of the news section. There's a cool G.I. Joe artwork in there. And this was the first announcement. So Hasbro has announced it will be releasing all new, completely redesigned figures of the classic 3 3/4 inch G.I. Joe figures in January 2022. This is a pedal to the metal, fully dedicated relaunch of the real American heroes that attacked comic book, cartoons, and toy shelves from 1982 to 1994. Joes will arrive in 6 2-packs, photos coming in a future issue of Toy Fair, pairing each with a Cobra counterpart. For example, head honcho Duke will butt heads with Cobra Commander, and fan favorite Snake Eyes will share a card with Storm Shadow. The figures will be packaged head-to-head, weapons ready for an in the midst of battle look. So hearing that was pretty exciting because you hear that they say all new sculpts, and that you hear it's going to be a pedal to the metal, fully dedicated relaunch. Because even though G.I. Joe, a real American hero, had gone dormant in 1994, G.I. Joe hadn't been dead completely. They had done all kinds of little soft relaunches before this 2002 launch. I think it was 1995. They launched kind of a new format for G.I. Joe, and it was called Sergeant Savage. That didn't even last a year. There was like a single wave of figures that came out. And then they tried to relaunch G.I. Joe as G.I. Joe Extreme, which was larger figures with less articulation. They were actually produced by Kenner. I think Hasbro had licensed out G.I. Joe to Kenner. And then after that, they had done some of these anniversary figures. So they had taken old figures from the 80s and repackaged them, and they put them on multi-packs. But they were just repaints of old toys, and so they did that for about 4 or 5 years, and it was hard to get excited about. Okay, this is just a toy I already have in my collection. It's just got a new paint job, and it was a little frustrating because it kind of felt like Hasbro wasn't trying very hard. Like you had a repaint of the Snow Job figure, which is clearly Snow Job, but they called him Whiteout. So with this launch in 2002, the fact that they say it's a pedal to the metal, fully dedicated relaunch, it sounded like, okay, they're taking it seriously. They're not just throwing us a bone, trying to make a little bit of money with these repaints and anniversary packs. They're doing fully sculpted brand new figures. So that was pretty exciting news to get in late 2001. So 3 months later, we got another issue of Toy Fair magazine. This is issue 54, cover dated February 2002. And this is Yo Joe, G.I. Joe and Cobra Return. And so on the cover, we get our first look at the brand new Cobra Commander. So this isn't something that, we would have already seen on the internet and critiqued the hell out of or anything. Like, this was the first time we were seeing it. By the way, here we are. This is an article about the return of Masters of the Universe 2, showing off some of the new Masters of the Universe sculpts. I was almost equally excited for the new Masters of the Universe figures as I was for the new G.I. Joe figures. And the fact that these were happening at the same time was pretty exciting. I might have to do an episode on Masters of the Universe at a future date. But anyway, here we go. G.I. Joe on page 60. So we get back in action, and there's a picture of the brand new Duke and Cobra Commander figures. The theme of the relaunch is Joe versus Cobra and good versus evil. So 6 all-American heroes are paired off against 6 Cobra counterparts in 2-packs. 4 additional 2-packs are set to invade store shelves in late April. While we're seeing redesigns of Snake Eyes and Destro in the gang, the famous O-ring was scrapped. The rubber band-like innards of the classic 3-inchers are being tossed aside by Hasbro in favor of a step up in sculpting. Collectors needn't go AWOL though, since these Joes will still be twistable at the waist and maintain all 12 points of articulation. Toy Fair recently snuck behind Hasbro lines to garner a peek at the newest troops, so tuck in your dog tags and get a sneak peek at the new recruits. Now, I assume if you're watching this, you know what an O-ring is. But one of the reasons that G.I. Joe figures in the 80s were so beloved is because the toys that came before them were usually pretty stiff. Like the Star Wars figures of the late 70s, early 80s that really popularized the 3 3/4 inch scale, they only had 5 points of articulation. Their heads moved side to side, their arms moved forward like this, and their legs moved forward and backwards as well. You couldn't make them do the splits, you couldn't put their arms out to the side, you couldn't have them look down or look up or anything like that. Very rigid, and that was pretty standard across the toy industry. G.I. Joe came along, they gave them elbows and knees, and one of the greatest things was this elastic waistband that held them together, which was just a little rubber washer that was called an O-ring, and that allowed them to swivel around like this, and you could move their torso, rock them back and forth, so you could really kind of crunch them up and fit them into their vehicles and everything like that, and it made them very posable. And it was just so much better articulation than so many other figures that were out there on the market. So to take away the O-ring was a controversial move. And if the internet existed in its present format, they probably would have got destroyed by fans on the internet about the loss of the O-ring. And to be fair, I think they did get destroyed anyway. So you see there the Duke and the Cobra Commander fully painted. Now, my initial thoughts on them is they look pretty cool. They look pretty buff. They went with the hooded Cobra Commander look, which is pretty cool. That seems to be a look that they shy away from nowadays. So it's kind of interesting that was the first look they went with, because Cobra Commander has 2 kind of equally distinctive looks. His silver, battle helmet, and then the hood. So they went with the hood here. So beyond those fully painted ones, the back page here shows you some prototype figures. So they are not painted, it's just cast in a solid color. And then there is some concept art along beside them. So this was kind of interesting. And so that the next 2-pack, like Duke and Cobra Commander, makes total sense. For all intents and purposes, those are the leaders of the 2 teams. So that's why you would put them together. And those, obviously, you want to put them in the first wave of figures because every kid knows them, every kid's going to want them. Same as, we'll get to them, Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow are coming. Again, those are two of the most recognizable characters. They have a built-in rivalry. That makes total sense. But knowing that we were only getting 6 2-packs, it's curious that one of the figures we were going to get is Heavy Duty, because he was a figure that came out late in the vintage line. He was not a character that was really featured in the cartoons, at least not the Sunbow cartoons. I grew up on the Sunbow cartoons, which are they're remembered pretty well. I'm sure they're a little corny and stuff, but the quality of the animation was well done. There was a cartoon produced by another company called Deke later, and I never saw it. I don't think it ever aired where I lived, so I didn't even know that thing existed until years later. I think Heavy Duty was featured in that cartoon, but by no means was he a popular character from the brand, and it seemed like an interesting, an odd choice to relaunch with Heavy Duty, but that's who we got. And then he's packaged with a brand new character, because Cobra had a ton of different troopers. Not only did they have their generic Cobra infantry trooper, which we refer to as blue shirts, but then there's the Cobra Viper, which is the standard infantry, and then you had all the specialties within the Viper ranks. You had the Strato Viper, the Ice Viper, the Heat Viper, the Night Viper, the Hydro Viper, the Toxo Viper, the Techno Viper. I could go on and on. There's so many. So again, interesting choice that they decided to go with a brand new character, which is called the Cobra Claws, or just Claws, and it's an acronym that stands for Cobra Light Armored Weapons System. And he was just a unique look. He looked really cool. The concept art especially looks cool. The prototype figure looks a little off, but that's because the proportions on all of these figures is a little off. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But anyway, so that was the next 2-pack. On to the next page there. Again, this just talks about Duke and Cobra Commander again. So again, you get some cool concept art for each character. Yep, not bad. Duke is the least interesting looking one. And right off the bat, something that's obvious that you can see with him is his helmet is sculpted onto his head, which I don't like. A lot of the vintage figures, their helmets came off. I would say most of them. So when you get a helmet sculpted on there like that, that's not great. So then the next page, we only get to see one of the figures because half of the page is an ad. But here you see Gung Ho. So that's the G.I. Joe Marine. That makes sense that he would be on there because he's a pretty beloved character from the old cartoon. And yeah, it's an interesting look. But again, it's hard to really get a good sense of what he's going to look like because he's just cast in solid green or black plastic there. So you don't really see the painted version. Now it says he's going to be packaged with Destro. So we see Destro here on the next page. And along with him, we see Frostbite. So again, cool concept art. Like I think Frostbite looks awesome in his concept art. You see he comes with skis. Now what's interesting about Frostbite is G.I. Joe had a number of Arctic troopers in the vintage line. Snow Job, who I mentioned previously, was kind of the most well-known because he was the first. So he was the one that appeared in the cartoons and he was in the comic books. And it seems like if you're going to do one Arctic trooper, you would do Snow Job. Now, sure, you could have done Blizzard, or you could have done Sub-Zero. You could have done Iceberg, but they went with Frostbite. And Frostbite, he was a vehicle driver in the vintage collection, and he had a black beard and mustache. So it seemed like a weird choice. Like this character, to me, looks more like the vintage character Blizzard, because he's got skis and he's clean shaven. He's got these goggles. It looks more like Blizzard, but they're calling him Frostbite. So again, why they went with Frostbite and why did they take away his beard and stuff, I don't know. But that's the choice they made. And it says he comes with Neo Viper. And the Neo Viper is featured on the next page. Again, also with an ad at the bottom here. But the Neo Viper, this guy really piqued my curiosity because I think the concept art, again, looks awesome. And I'll just go right into the description of him. So here's the debriefing. The next step in Cobra infantry troops. These officers have been genetically altered with biotech engineering to regulate their body temperatures. They can withstand extreme cold or heat and move at tremendous speeds. I think this guy really carries forward the great legacy of Cobra troops. These kind of sinister guys that have a really neat themed look about them. We plan on reusing Neo Viper throughout the line. We can bring it back a couple of times with different deco schemes. I think he's that good of a trooper. He's very reminiscent of the Vipers, and I think people are going to use him much the same way that they did the Vipers. They'll want to get a lot of these guys. We're going to take a look at the figure in a little bit, but I absolutely love this thing. Does it replace the classic blue shirt infantry trooper? No, I think we're going to get those guys later. They didn't come out in 2002 at the relaunch, which seems odd to me, but they definitely added them the following year, and I'm glad they did. But I really like the addition of the Neo Viper, and they did repaint it in multiple color schemes, and I did collect the hell out of them. I have a lot of Neo Vipers. I really, really like this design. Anyway, we'll flip over here to the next 2-pack. So this was like kind of an aquatic theme pack. This has Wetsuit, which is the G.I. Joe, one of the G.I. Joe divers, which I was glad they went with Wetsuit. They could have went with Torpedo. He was the original G.I. Joe diver. But as a kid, my brother Doug owned Torpedo and I owned Wetsuit. So I had more of an attachment to Wetsuit. I think he had a more interesting costume. Now they have changed up, and costume, uniform, I guess is probably the proper word. They've changed up his uniform here, but he looks pretty cool, and I was excited to get Wetsuit again. And he comes packaged with the Cobra Moray, who looks cool. The concept art, again, for the Cobra Moray looks awesome. I'm really, this guy looks really interesting here. The figure, maybe the proportions look a little bit weird compared to the really cool concept art, but I think you just kind of have to accept that the proportions were a little different on these figures. They were a little bulkier. Sort of like when the Star Wars figures came back in the 90s. Initially, they were pretty buff. Like even little farm boy Luke Skywalker was kind of muscly, and that's just the way figures were being sculpted at the time. So yeah, they don't quite match the concept art, but they look cool. The Moray was also a kind of a curious choice to me at the time because they have other underwater Cobra troopers. Most notably is the Cobra Eel. So why didn't they give us a Cobra Eel? There's also the Hydro Viper. There's also Undertow. So several Cobra divers, but they came up with something new, the Cobra Moray. So even though those choices are a little bit weird, this is partly what got me excited about this, is I didn't need a rehash of what we got in the 80s. I was happy that it wasn't a complete reimagining with all new characters. I was happy to see Duke and Wetsuit and Gung Ho and all those guys. But the addition of new Cobra Troopers made me think like, okay, they're taking this seriously. They're really pushing a relaunch, and they're not just leaning on nostalgia alone. They're really trying to push the brand forward. So then what do we got? I think one last 2-pack to talk about. And this is the one probably a lot of people were looking forward to. This is Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow. Now, oddly enough, all we get for those guys is the concept art. They did not show us a prototype of the figure. Now, I'm not sure why that is. I don't know if they explained it in here or not. But let's see what they say about Snake Eyes, at least. This top-notch soldier lost his voice and received massive facial scarring during a tragic helicopter mission. Dressed in black, he refuses to remove his mask in front of others and communicates via sign language. He studied mystical magic arts with the Arashikaji clan, where he met his sword brother Storm Shadow. He's a little more muscly and his stance is a little wider. He looks pretty cool when you pose him. I'd say he's closer to version 2 of Snake Eyes, the one that came with the Wolf Timber in 1985. So, yeah, this article had me super excited. I must have flicked through that dozens of times back when this magazine came out in 2002. Just super excited. The G.I. Joe was coming back. I thought the designs were promising. Looked really cool. So the following month, we got issue 55. Again, we've got Darth Vader on the cover. Star Wars was still all the rage right there. Now, at this point, And look at the back there. We got an ad for Perfect Dark figure. Remember Perfect Dark? That was an N64 game. It's crazy, what was popular stuff at the time. It just makes this feel so long ago when I think of them pushing N64 figures. Anyway, so in this magazine, we get some more sketches here on page 12 of some upcoming figures. So you can see we've got concept art for Scarlet, which she's an obvious character that they're going to want to put out, and Stalker, he seems like another obvious choice. And then we've also got Firefly, the Cobra Saboteur, and we've got a pretty weird design for Quick Kick, which they might talk about this. I'm not going to read through the article, but I know for a fact we never got this design of Quick Kick that they're showing us here. And I don't know if they mentioned that this was a sample that got rejected, or maybe at this point they still thought they were going to go forward with it. But yeah, this version of Quick Kick here, that never came up. Anyway, a couple of pages later in here, we get some more reveals of some fully painted figures. So in the last issue, we didn't get to see a prototype of Snake Eyes. We did get Heavy Duty and Claws and Destro and Gung Ho, but they weren't painted, so it was hard to get a sense of them. But here we go. Here is fully painted prototypes of these new characters. So our first time seeing Snake Eyes at all. You can kind of see that wide stance. These guys, they are pre-posed just ever so slightly. I find the ninjas probably more so than the other ones. But yeah, they do have a little bit more of a wider action stance than what we saw in the 80s. So the following month, in issue 56, you can see here they're showing some new Simpsons figures from, I think it was Playmates that were doing those at the time. Not much G.I. Joe news in there. But the following month, we've got Jango Fett on the cover, and we have some reveals for Wave 2 of G.I. Joe in here. So when we open this issue up to page 38, we get some new reveals here, which I'll show you. But it's interesting to note that this is just Wave 2. So I assume maybe Wave 1 figures were in some people's hands. I'm not even certain of that yet. But you saw how they were touting that they were getting rid of the O-ring in favor of increased sculpting. That's how they sold it to us a couple issues ago. Now, in this preview section of Toy Fair, we get a little blurb about the new figures. So it says, G.I. Joe vs. Cobra. Starting with Wave 2, the O-ring hip system is back. Also back are Larry Hama, writing file cards and mini-comics, and tons of classic characters. Over the course of 2002, we'll see Scarlet vs. Zartan, Beachhead vs. Dr. Mindbender, Flint vs. Baroness, Blowtorch vs. Snow Serpent, Dusty vs. Desert Cobra Claws, Sergeant Stalker vs. Neo Viper Commander, Big Ben vs. Alley Viper, Surefire vs. Cobra Slice, Mirage vs. Cobra Viper, General Tomahawk vs. Headman, and Nunchuck vs. Firefly. There will also be new O-ring versions of Snake Eyes and Cobra Commander, and Snake Eyes and Firefly will have extra wrist and ankle joints. So, we see these figures here, so they show us just a few of those figures. So you see Zartan, Scarlet, Flint and Baroness, Dusty, the Snow Serpent. You also see some 12-inch figures there. There's a new 12-inch Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow. There's Dr. Mindbender there. A 12-inch Cobra Commander that we're seeing here. And there's also a vehicle. So this is the first time we're seeing one of the vehicles. This is the Night Attack Chopper. And the little blurb here says, starting this summer, Hasbro will introduce Sound Attack, where weapons included with each figure will trigger one of 16 different attack sounds when plugged into a vehicle. The Joe Assault Quad and Sand Razor and the Cobra Fang 3 helicopter and Hiss 4 tank kick off the line. And the massive G.I. Joe Night Attack Chopper will also feature spinning rotors and missile launching action. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. So just to give you an idea of how big a push Hasbro put on this line of G.I. Joes. So when they relaunched G.I. Joe in 1982, I don't know how much of a sure thing they thought it was. Maybe it was a little bit risky. because G.I. Joe had been really popular, in the 60s and 70s with the 12-inch dolls that they had. And then they kind of fizzled out. And when they decided to relaunch G.I. Joe in the 80s with a whole new, concept, smaller figures with multiple characters instead of just focusing on one G.I. Joe in different outfits type of thing. But anyway, when they launched that, there was 16 figures in total that came out in 1982. There was the 13 Joes and then 3 bad guys, Cobra Commander, the Trooper, and the Officer. So kind of, pretty modest new line of toys. G.I. Joe grew very quickly. And I would argue that maybe 1985 is kind of the peak of G.I. Joe. Now, why would I say that? Like, the cartoon was going well, the comic books were going well. Just to give you an idea on how successful the brand was, 1985 was the year that they put out the USS Flag aircraft carrier, which was 6 feet long. It was this massive play set. Most kids, it would take up their entire bedroom. I don't know what this thing retailed for at the time. It was probably close to $100. Nowadays, if that thing came out, it would be like $1,000. Like, it was expensive. It was big. But Hasbro felt that they had so many kids invested in G.I. Joe that it seemed like they couldn't fail. So the fact that they were confident enough to put out this aircraft carrier in 1985, I think it's safe to say that that was maybe when G.I. Joe was at its most powerful. And even then, to consider all of the single released figures plus the vehicle drivers and everything like that, in 1985 there was 29 unique G.I. Joe figures to collect. So there were more than that in later years, but that's because there was a lot more repaints and reuse of parts and stuff like that. But at the peak of its popularity, you got less than 30 figures to collect. Now, when G.I. Joe got relaunched in 1995 with Sergeant Savage, there were 16 total figures. When it got relaunched in 1995 again with G.I. Joe Extreme, 17 figures in its collection. In 2005, they relaunched it with the figures were like 7 inches tall. It was called Sigma 6. There was 11 figures in the first year of Sigma 6. In 2007, when they launched the 4-inch figures, which were quite successful, more successful than they realized, there was 38 of the 4-inch figures released in 2007. And the current line of G.I. Joes, which is the 6-inch G.I. Joe Classified line, which seems to be doing very well for Hasbro, when that line was launched in 2020, there was 17 figures included in that first year. So those are kind of the launch numbers. When they're trying out something new, just to give you an idea of where we were. In 2002, 101 new figures came out. Like, that is a lot of figures in a very short period of time, considering that they say the first series of figures was coming out in January, which in more realistically, it was probably a month or two after that. And for them to squeeze out 101 figures in that 12-month period of time, plus to course correct, like, they'd obviously put out these non-O-ring figures and were trying to sell that as like, this is really cool. Fans obviously didn't like it, and they very quickly pivoted. They got the O-ring back by wave 2, and they managed to get out like another 80 O-ring figures before the end of the year. Like, it's crazy. That's a lot of figures. So if you're a collector and you like collecting, like, there's not much more you can ask for. It's too much, to be honest with you. Like, I didn't get nearly all 101 figures. I don't know how many I bought exactly in 2002. I tried to get all the unique characters because they did a lot of characters multiple times. I think there was like 4 different Snake Eyes released in that year alone. So I didn't buy all those multiples, but I tried to get as many of the unique characters as I could. So yeah, crazy stuff. So anyway, let's move on to the action figures. So it was noted in these magazines that figures were going to be sold in 2-packs, which, as I mentioned, was kind of unique, something new, because the vintage line had always been sold as individuals. So I have one of the 2-packs that I want to show you. Now, they did change the packaging style over time. Like, for the through those few years where the new Sculpt era existed, they changed their theme, they changed the packaging color, they released single figures, they released multi-packs, they tried everything. But when G.I. Joe first launched with those initial figures that I just talked about, this is what they looked like. Now, I usually open up all of my action figures. This one here is one I bought actually not too long ago from a toy show, and I decided, you know what, I don't even have these figures currently on display. All my figures from this era are in tote bins. So when I saw this, I'm like, well, I'm not going to ruin this 20-year-old toy and just throw them in a bin. So I bought this and I had it pinned on my wall as a display piece. Now that I've kind of redone my toy room recently with the new paint job and everything, and I don't have things pinned all up over my wall, I don't really know what I'm going to do with this. I could open up these figures, but you know, this set is 22 years old now. It seems like a shame to open it up at this point. Anyway, so this gives you an idea of what it looks like. It says G.I. Joe versus Cobra. You've got kind of a standard artwork at the top there, which is, I guess, supposed to be Duke. Doesn't really look like Duke, though. Fighting Cobra Commander. And then it talked about in the magazine how they were in this battle-ready pose, like they were already fighting each other with diorama background. So I don't know if you can see behind them, but it looks like there's a bit of a, like it looks like they're maybe in a warehouse or a laboratory or something. There's just some sort of artwork behind them. And the characters are kind of in mid-jumping pose. Like you see Headman's legs are out and Hawk is mid-jump. Yeah, so this was Headman and General Tomahawk, as they're calling him here. And this is the packaging. So it doesn't have the unique character, you know, so I missed that from the 80s where you had the explosion and the toy you were buying. There would have been a picture of Hawk and Headman on it instead of, you know, just this kind of generic photo. Now, even though these guys were from like a later wave 2 or 3 or whatever, the cross-sell on the back shows all the wave 1 figures. So you see those initial 6 Joes, which was Duke, Gung-Ho, Wetsuit, Snake Eyes, Heavy Duty, and Frostbite, and the 6 cross-sell of the Cobras. And all those drawings there, so it doesn't show the actual figure, it shows the concept art that we saw in that article of the Toy Fair earlier. So, you know, I prefer the old packaging where you got the unique artwork on every card and the back had, you know, a full picture of all the figures that were coming out and you kind of use it as a checklist. Like, this is adequate for the Wave 1 figures, but obviously the fact that Hawk and Headman are not featured on the back of the package, if you were a kid and you went in the store and you bought this, you would not know, like, well, what other figures are available? Because there's obviously more than these 12 because I've got some in my hand. So I wish it had the up-to-date cross-promotion on the back there and everything. But anyway, it is a cool, dynamic packaging. I like it. Might not be as cool as the old stuff, but it's not too bad. Now on to the figures. I'll try not to dwell too long because, yeah, this video is going long. But let's start with, well, we'll start with my favorite, perhaps. So here's the Neo Viper. So this is the new kind of basic infantry trooper. And I do love this design still. As I mentioned, I bought a whole bunch of these guys. And I bought them in a bunch of different colors. There was yellow ones and red ones and all that sort of stuff. I think I'm going to have to do a part 2 to this video so I can cover the years that followed, 2003, 2004. And if I post that, then you'll get a closer look at the yellow and the red and the tan and the white and all the other versions of the Neo Viper that they released. But the proportions are a little goofy. Like the shoulders are really broad on all these guys. They have these very big ball jointed shoulders, which doesn't really look like a human anatomy, that they have these big bulbous shoulders. I think it looks pretty good on him though. Perhaps because he's armored and everything, it kind of works. The legs on a lot of these guys I find look a little short, but again, I think it works okay for him. I think his proportions actually look pretty good. Now, he doesn't have the O-ring. Now, before the end of 2002, they actually re-released this toy, or maybe it was not until 2003. I think that article we read, it said that Cobra Commander and Snake Eyes were going to be re-released. So they took those exact versions of Cobra Commander and Snake Eyes from Wave 1 and re-released them just slightly tweaked so that they'd have the O-ring. They did tweak this figure, but it might not have been until the following year. So I have this exact same figure with the O-ring, so he's got better articulation. This guy here has what is known as a T-crotch. And all of these figures, you're going to see that. They all have the T-crotch. And that just basically means that it's kind of a T-shaped and the legs can only move forward and backwards like an old Star Wars figure or like a modern day reaction figure. It doesn't allow them to do the splits. They can't do any ninja kicks to the side or anything like that. It's the type of thing that kind of signifies a cheaper figure. Like all of those G.I. Joe knockoffs that you could buy from the dollar store back in the day, that's how you knew it wasn't a real G.I. Joe, because it probably had shitty T-crotch articulation. So even though I don't think this is terrible, it's definitely a step down. I don't think they did improve the sculpting enough to justify the change. Although one thing I will say that's nice about these figures is most of my vintage G.I. Joes from the 80s are in pieces. If you watch my videos regularly, I often pull out my old 80s figures to compare them to the new like classified figures, and they're almost always, the legs are broken off, they're in half. And it's not because I was rough with my toys, it's just those rubber elastics, the O-rings, erode over time, and if you, especially when they're not being used, it gets stiff and it breaks, it rots away. So say what you will about these figures, the fact that they don't have an O-ring, this guy will probably stay together another 30 years. As long as I don't drop him on the floor or anything, he's probably going to stay in one piece, and he looks good. So there is a positive aspect to removing the O-ring. But fortunately, most of the figures I have from the early 2000s, because most of them did have O-rings after this wave one, most of them are still together. They haven't broken apart yet, but I'm sure that's coming. Probably within the next 10 years, they'll all be broken. But for now, they look all right. So anyway, I love Neo Viper. I love the look of his helmet. It's very, very cool. I would love to see Hasbro revisit this design as a 6-inch classified figure. I think this would be awesome. It's actually one of my top wants for a modern classified figure, even above and beyond some of my favorite 80s figures that they haven't done yet. Like, would I love to get a fast draw figure in classified? Sure. But I really, really do want a Neo Viper. And if you ask me who do I want more, well, I don't know. I just love this. I love this design. Next, we'll take a look at Frostbite. So again, I really like this design. It just doesn't look like Frostbite to me. And it does make me wonder why they chose to call this guy Frostbite. I wouldn't have wanted them to call him Snowjob either, because he doesn't have a beard. Now, I know people can shave their beards. It's not that weird that Frostbite used to have a beard and now he doesn't. But I just think they maybe should have called this guy Blizzard, because it looks more like Blizzard. But whatever. Anyway, he's got that T-crotch. As I said, all these figures have the T-crotch, so I'm not going to harp about it. People that don't like that T-crotch, they hate these figures and they can't see anything positive about them. I like them. I like the sculpting on them. They're not my favorite G.I. Joe, but I like that it was something new. I think, those figures that were coming out in the late 90s that were just, anniversary figures, repaints of toys I already have, it just wasn't something to get me excited. These things got me way more excited. They were just something new. The sad thing about this guy is, because he's mostly white plastic, is he is yellowing pretty bad. When I show a close-up of him, you'll see his whole torso is all yellow, which kind of sucks. But yeah, he's got a couple of guns. He's got a backpack where you can plug his skis on. He's got you can also plug he's got ski poles that will plug onto his backpack. It's the same backpack that Snowjob came with back in 1983 or 84. But yeah, they're still using it, and it still works. But yeah, this guy's pretty good. I will say it's kind of cheesy that it says G.I. Joe down his pant leg. He's not the only guy to have that, but it does seem pretty corny, and I can't imagine a real soldier running into battle with, U.S. Army written down his front of his pants. I don't know. Seems a little silly. Then we'll look at the next 2-pack here. So we'll go with Heavy Duty. So again, I'm surprised they didn't go with Roadblock, who's the much more well-known heavy machine gunner. But they went with Heavy Duty, and I'm okay with that. We did get Roadblock eventually. And this guy's cool. I like his look. He looks kind of top heavy, like his legs look maybe a little bit short. The proportions could be better, sure, but I think the sculpting's good. I like the look of his face. Um, it's funny to see these old weapons. Like he's got Roadblock's old machine gun that originally came out in like 1985, just like Frostbite has Snowjob's old backpack. So you've got this brand new sculpted figure, and yet they're pairing them with these like really old weapons. I think his backpack is new. He also came with a couple other little accessories, but overall, yeah, I like him. He's not too bad. And he came packaged with Cobra claws, or I keep saying Cobra claws, but it's claws, which stands for Cobra something or other. And I like this guy a lot. I like his design, but he definitely feels, I think, of all these figures, the most top heavy. Like he looks really big and beefy at the top, really wide set shoulders, but then little teeny legs. And the fact that he comes with his giant gun, whoops, which by the way is just Heat Viper's gun from the vintage line. So again, vintage weapon coming with a new toy. So the fact that he's carrying this gigantic gun around, I think just it's extra comedic seeing his little legs. It's a little funny. I think if he had just a pistol, it might not be so jarring, but yeah, he looks like a little person almost. But I like the sculpt. I like the helmet design. I like the colors. This is another character that they repainted in a bunch of different colors. I've got a tan one. I've got a purple one. I've got a white and gray camo one. And even though I think those colors looked good on the Neo Viper, I don't think any of the repaints of the Cobra Claws ever looked as good as this kind of maroon and gold original. So yeah, he's a very cool figure. I like him quite a bit. We'll move on to Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow. Let's start with Storm Shadow. He came with a couple of guns, a little knife, and then he's got 2 swords, which can be stored on his backpack. So that's pretty cool. They can be sheathed in there, but the swords like come out like that. This is an interesting design for Storm Shadow. It's pretty different from anything we've seen before. I don't mind it. It's still mostly white, which is kind of his signature color. I like the added red. I think they did better versions of the white and red Storm Shadow down the road. One that kind of had like a red dragon painted down one side of him and stuff looked really cool. So this is kind of a work in progress, I guess I would say. But I think this guy's head is too small. I think his legs are posed a little too wide, too far apart. He's also got big, wide shoulders, which I feel the ninja maybe shouldn't look so beefy. And yeah, he's yellowing, so that's not any fault of, the figure when it was first released. That's something that sucks now over time. That yeah, it's obviously a different type of plastic. His arms and legs are still nice and white, and his head, but his torso and his sword sheaths are all yellow. So that's kind of a bummer. But it's not a bad design. I like this figure okay. This next one is kind of a hard one for me to critique. This is Snake Eyes, and I kind of hate this figure, but I also kind of love it. His legs are sculpted really wide. You can't bring them any closer together because of that T-crotch. There's no give. So he can kick forward, but otherwise he's stuck in this really wide stance. He came with a gun, like a little Uzi. He's got a knife that sheathes on his leg. He's got the 2 swords that cross on his back, just like Storm Shadow. But his design is weird. Most of us think of Snake Eyes as the solid black character. Maybe he had a little bit of gray. I don't know what color I would describe this as, but it's not black. It's almost like a greenish gray. And then he's got kind of, I guess, grayish brown pouches. Then he's got some blue wrappings around his feet and his forearms and stuff. And weirdest of all is his really pronounced sculpted face. Like you can see his nose and his lips very clearly through his mask, which is a little off-putting because that's not how it appeared in like the vintage comic books. But if you go back and look at that 1985 Ninja Snake Eyes figure, you can see his lips in that figure. but it's a little more hidden. It's kind of tucked away under his visor. Here, it's like you can't help but see that nose and its mouth, and it's really bizarre looking. And yet, it's just so different from the Snake Eyes toys that I had in the 80s that I do kind of love it. Um, it's hard to describe why, because I think it's kind of bad, but it's kind of cool. Next, we'll move on to Gung Ho. This guy came with, so I've got him with this really big, kind of oversized uh, Magnum, I guess. It looks a little silly on him. I don't love this figure. It's not bad, but Gung Ho is not a character I'm all that excited about. Of all the characters here, him and Heavy Duty are probably the ones I'm least excited about. But this just doesn't really look like the Gung Ho that I know. It's a little too far removed and just not in an exciting new way. If anything, they made him more generic. The vintage Gung Ho had the exposed chest with the tattoo on there. You know, he had kind of a baby blue outfit. This guy here is just an army green, which maybe is more realistic. He doesn't have his bare chest, so you can't see his tattoo. He just looks a little too generic. And he's got a goatee now instead of just a little mustache. I don't know. It just doesn't really look like Gung Ho. I was fine with it, but it's just not great. Destro. This is a weird one. This one I sort of feel similarly as I did with the Snake Eyes. I think it's pretty bad, and yet I think my nostalgia wins out. Although even back then, there was something about this that appealed to me even then, even though I know it's bad. Like the old vintage Destro had this chrome head that was reflective, and it looked like it was just a big metal mask that he was sealed into. Now the cartoon kind of made you a little confused because he could talk and emote through the mask. So it's like, is this a mask? Does he get a metal face? How does this work? But this one here, it's clearly like a mask because you can see his flesh tone here, which you couldn't on the vintage figure. Like you could see some flesh, but here he's got exposed ears and everything, which is very weird. So the silver mask doesn't cover his whole head. The back of his scalp is exposed and his ears are exposed. So it clearly looks like something he just puts over his face. And he's got a gritted teeth and a scowl here. And it just makes you wonder, how does this mask work? The mask looks a little busy too. Like it's not just smooth like the vintage one. It's got a lot of extra moving parts, and I don't know. It's a little weird looking, but it's something different. It's something new. We did get Destro's more faithful to the original later on in the line, same as Snake Eyes. So these are just kind of a one-off. If this was the only Destro I got in the new Sculpt era, maybe I would be a little more like, I wish this was better. But considering we got better ones, I kind of like having this just for what it is. It's kind of a weird little oddity. So next we'll take a look at Wetsuit. Now this guy's pretty cool. I think he's pre-posed a little weird, but I like the look of him. Like the design is similar. It's reminiscent to the original Wetsuit, but it's different. He's got Torpedo's old backpack, which is kind of interesting. And then he's got the original like kind of lantern that the original Wetsuit had. He's got these new flippers that look okay. But his legs are sculpted in kind of a weird way. It looks like one leg is kind of longer than the other one. He's also got a little harpoon gun, which is, I believe, Torpedo's vintage gun. But the thing that really makes this figure stand out is that his little mask comes off, and you can see Wetsuit's head for the first time. Because we saw Wetsuit without his helmet on in the cartoons, and probably the comic books too. But yeah, in the vintage toy, he had this big scuba helmet on. Now, the thing is, when I played with my G.I. Joes as a kid, you know, you had guys that were in environmental specific outfits. They were forced to kind of hang out in those outfits, even when they're hanging out in G.I. Joe headquarters. So it was a little easier to understand why Snow Job might still have his winter jacket and his hood on, even though they're just hanging out at headquarters. But having Wetsuit in his scuba helmet with his breather on and stuff, that really was kind of hard to justify, but his helmet didn't come off, so what could you do? So the fact that this guy has his helmet come off, that's a big plus. So I like it. The black design is actually really cool. Although I do miss the kind of teal and orange of the vintage one. I wish they had repainted this figure in the classic colors, but this is still a pretty solid figure, I think. And he came packaged with the Cobra Moray, and this I think is a really cool figure too. He suffers a little bit from being pre-posed. Like I think I'd like him. I don't know if saying more neutral is what I want, but if he was just more posable, so you could choose to put him neutral or a little more, in a bit of a pose here. But here he's it's not drastic, but it's just the fact that his legs are a little far apart, his arms are a little bent. He's just got a bit of a pose kind of built into the design. Um, yeah, he looks a little bit like Darth Vader to some degree. He's got that little chest plate with all the little buttons on there. The helmet looks really cool. It doesn't really look like a cobra eel or a hydro viper or any of those other underwater cobras. It looks like a unique design. And we did get this moray repainted in a couple of different colors later on down the line. I think this was the best one, the black and gray one. He's cool. I like him. So yeah, now as for his gun, I think that's maybe Hydro Viper's old gun. It's definitely a gun from the vintage line. But yeah, not too bad. And I think that leaves us with the last two that I'm going to talk about. Now, actually, I did not buy Duke and Cobra Commander. Now, I couldn't tell you why. I don't really remember. It might have been that I never saw them. So if I went to my comic shop and I found these 2-packs and they didn't have Duke and Cobra Commander, maybe it was that. It might have also been that I read that Toy Fair magazine and it told me that we were getting an O-ring Cobra Commander in the same year. So I do have Cobra Commander to show you. This is the Cobra Commander, and if you look at that cover of the magazine that we had earlier, like this, it looks like him. That's that figure. But that one that's on the cover had the T-crotch. This is the later version. So I did not get that original 2-pack, but I bought the later one that I guess came packaged with snake eyes. I don't really remember. But you can see he spins at the waist in the way that those other guys don't. And he can kick his legs out to the side. He's got that O-ring articulation. So it's better. It feels more like the vintage figures in that regard. He's kind of a weird mix because he's still got the big broad shoulders and that kind of contemporary for the time design of Cobra Commander, and yet he's got the more slender, agile legs of the vintage toy. So yeah, these guys are kind of a weird mishmash, kind of a crossover. It's probably superior, like objectively, to the other T-crotch characters, but at least they were, their own thing. They felt like something different, clearly separate from the vintage 80s figures. These are kind of weird hybrids. So yeah, I don't know if this is a super successful Cobra Commander figure. Like it's a cool concept. I do like the sculpt of the head. I wish you could kind of see his eyes a little bit more through there. But anyway, he's not too bad. And the Duke that came with that original Cobra Commander, where the helmet was sculpted to his head, I never got that figure. I did get a Duke from 2002. This guy came out later, and it might have been I just didn't like that Duke with the green helmet sculpted on his head. It just didn't look enough like Duke. He was all green, whereas the Duke that everybody remembers from the vintage toy line and the vintage cartoon, he had a tan shirt. You want to see his blonde hair. So this version from later on, he's got a black vest on, but you can see he's wearing it over his tan short sleeve shirt. You can see his blonde hair. He did have a helmet that you could put on over top of his head, but it was removable. So this looks much more like a classic Duke. So I just held off and waited for this one, which is much better. Although now, just for the sake of my collection, I kind of wish I had picked up those Wave 1 T-crotch figures just to kind of have them as a relic. Anyway, I have all the other ones, so why not those ones? Interesting to note here, if you look at his gun, he's got this big, awkward piece of plastic that looks like it's not supposed to be there, like it should have been cut off at the factory. But that is the sound attack gimmick that one of the articles mentioned. So when you plugged that into one of the vehicles or something, and it made a sound or something. So I don't know. It's a stupid gimmick. I think they first did that in the 90s at some point, but it really makes the weapons look ridiculous. So I don't know why they decided to bring that back. But anyway, that's Duke. He's not too bad. Anyway, at this point in time, this video is quite long. I'm going to try and edit it down to under an hour, so I don't know how much I'm going to have to chop out of this thing. But I hope you enjoyed this kind of trip down memory lane with me to look at the relaunch of G.I. Joe from 2002. If you did enjoy it, let me know. And if you guys did, if I get good feedback, I will probably do a follow-up episode to kind of look at some of the best figures that came out in 2003. I do have some of the other Toy Fair articles that I'd like to show you that show the reveals of the new figures. I have a few of those like other G.I. Joe merchandise that aren't the figures that I'd like to show you. I've got some of the 12-inch figures. I've got a trading card game or whatever. Some neat stuff. And again, when I originally conceived of this video, I thought I was going to fit all of that in here, which I guess I was nuts because there's just there was a lot to cover during those years of G.I. Joe. It was a glorious time to get lackluster figures. Anyway, if you enjoyed it, make sure you comment, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe. Stay tuned for my next episode, whether it's more G.I. Joe stuff or something else entirely. But I'll see you then. Ciao.